This letter calls for the West to seize peace in Ukraine before it's too late. I'm going to critique it. It appears in the Financial Times, one of the world's leading newspapers, which many policymakers read. But the arguments it makes are dangerously flawed. They could spell disaster for Ukraine and for Western security if put in practice. Some have accused the authors of having backgrounds congenial to pro-Kremlin bias. Here they are. Lord Skidelsky, Richard Sakwa, Anatol Levin, a journalist and 4 diplomats. I'm not going to go there. I won't question their integrity, but I will question their accuracy so strongly that they will risk coming out like buffoons. Now you might say, how could they be so wrong? They all know Russia deeply. Well, understanding requires closeness and distance. Sometimes you can be so close to something that you can no longer see it. Let's look at the letter in full. Russia's latest military gains in Donetsk region reinforce the case for a negotiated settlement of the war in Ukraine. Okay, let's see how. The US and its allies support Ukraine's key war aim, which is a return to the 2014 frontiers, Russia's expulsion from Crimea and the Donbass. They don't. The West does not support the full liberation of Ukraine's territories. They support sustenance of Ukraine's sovereignty and lasting peace. Let's go on. But all informed analysts agree that short of a serious escalation of war, the likeliest outcome will be continued stalemate on the ground with a not insignificant chance of a Russian victory. Most analysts are indeed skeptical of Ukraine regaining all of its territories. Let's go on. This conclusion points to the desirability, even urgency, of a negotiated peace, not least for the sake of Ukraine itself. It doesn't. It doesn't even bode well for the viability of peace. And that's because Ukraine has no negotiating position without adequate Western security guarantees. Peace without Western security guarantees would likely leave Ukraine economically wrecked, politically unstable, and unprotected from losing its sovereignty if and when Moscow attacks again. And we know that Moscow's aim of taking political control of Ukraine remains unchanged. It would leave the West in a bad way too. If Ukraine is pushed into a fraught peace, this would mean that a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance has got away with changing borders in Europe by force. It would mean that Europe's security arrangements are a product of Russo-Chinese power exercise. If and when Russia resumes the war after a Skidelsky's peace, NATO's survival may be at stake, especially under a Trump presidency. And Russia may resume the war in Ukraine or elsewhere, for instance, by organizing a provocation in the Baltics. Let's go on. Reluctance by the official West to accept the negotiated peace rests on the belief that anything short of a complete Ukrainian victory would allow Putin to get away with it. This, again, ain't true. The West and the Biden administration have never been committed to a Ukrainian victory. They have been committed to Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state. Let's go on. But this ignores by far the most important outcome of the war so far, that Ukraine has fought for its independence and won it, as Finland did in 1939-1940. Some territorial concessions would seem a small price to pay for the reality rather than semblance of independence. It hasn't. It hasn't guaranteed its independence. It has just survived. It still does not have adequate Western security guarantees, and it has a Russia on its border that is still set on taking full political control over it. The main mistake these authors make is to misunderstand crucial features of the Putin regime. Putin's war is causally driven by 2 elements. The first is regime security, and the second is what I call mystical foreign escalation. Let's look at them in turn. Putin's war is at least as much a regime security as a national security war. Regime security and war are constitutively linked for the Kremlin. As the wonderful Greg Uden has pointed out, in February 2022, Putin was not comparing February 2022 with war with February 2022 without war. He was looking to the future. His thought is that Belarus 2020 could be Russia in 2027. He was comparing Russia in 2027 with war and without war, and that comparison told him that peace is an existential threat to his domestic power. And since the full-scale invasion, Putin has taken steps to militarize the economy, orient the education system toward a big future conflict with the West, and he's taken limited steps to politicize Russia's depoliticized population. Read my lips. This is for Putin a defensive and regime security war. The second causal element of Putin's war is what I call a mystical vision, according to which Putin must propel Russia from the back row of nations to the front in a single swoop, thereby dismantling what is left of the international order. Put together, these two elements mean that Putin may well be open to negotiations, but for him, negotiations are a means of winning the war, not a means of achieving lasting peace. Let's go on. If a peace based on roughly the present division of forces in Ukraine is inevitable, it is immoral not to try for it now. Washington should start talks with Moscow on the new security pact, which would safeguard the legitimate security interests of both Ukraine and Russia. The announcement of these talks should be immediately followed by a time-limited ceasefire in Ukraine. The ceasefire would enable Russian and Ukrainian leaders to negotiate in a realistic and constructive manner. Let's reflect on this term, legitimate security interests. Throughout this letter, there is an implication of putatively benevolent intentions ascribed to the Kremlin, as though its fascicized and maniacally imperialist and mystical elements were blemishes rather than central features of it. Russia, like any country that exists, has legitimate security interests, but they don't include destroying Ukraine and changing borders in Europe by force. And you don't want your conception of legitimate security interests to be so wide that you end up aiding and abetting enemies of civilization. Let's go on. We urge the world's leaders to initiate or support such an initiative. The longer the war continues, the more territory Ukraine is likely to lose, and the more pressure for escalation up to nuclear level is likely to grow. I agree that nuclear escalation is a risk, but it is magical thinking to think that we can escape from it by appeasing Putin. Giving in to nuclear blackmail is a bad precedent. Moreover, even if Putin gets everything he wants in Ukraine, he will remain a major nuclear risk. Let's go on. The sooner peace is negotiated, the more lives will be saved. The sooner the reconstruction of Ukraine will start. The reconstruction of Ukraine cannot start meaningfully until Ukraine is secure from future Russian invasion. Let's do the last few words. And the more quickly the world can be pulled back from the very dangerous brink at which it currently stands. This sentence looks for a round of applause, but it rides roughshod over basic truths about Russia, about Ukraine, and about the West. Is this letter harmful in itself? No, because democracy depends on public contestation, and that includes contestation between good and bad views. A lot of people have read this letter, but 100,000 of you will watch my response to it. But how do you tell the difference between organic domestic conflict and conflict that is a product of malign foreign interference? To understand this, watch this video about Russian propaganda and what everybody needs to know about it.